In chapter 1 of the book of Esther, the stage was set. Namely, we learned something about the nature of King Ahasuerus, why he deposed Queen Vashti from being queen, and his edict to have a great beauty pageant so that they could choose a new queen. Now in chapter 2, more setting of the stage, so to say, will take place as we are introduced to two of the main characters in the book, namely Mordecai and Esther. Chapter 2 also details the procedure of how Esther became the new queen, and also reveals the critical fact that Esther did not disclose that she was Jewish. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, talk about the king agrees to hold this nationwide beauty pageant. And these verses say, "After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants who served him said, 'Let beautiful young virgins be brought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every beautiful young virgin to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young lady who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti.' And the matter pleased the king, and he did accordingly." Now, the words "after these things" in verse 1 suggest the passage of time, and that's confirmed by the fact that the king's banquet, according to chapter 1, verse 3, had taken place in the 3rd year of his reign. But Esther became the new queen in the 7th year of the king's reign, according to chapter 2, verse 16. Now, one reason for the delay is probably the Second Greco-Persian War. I mentioned it in an earlier lecture, in which Xerxes personally led the Persian invasion of Greece. The war took place from 480 to 478 BC. But the Persians ended up being defeated, and then they withdrew from Europe. Now, just as the king's command to Vashti apparently was contrary to Persian law, so was this procedure for getting a new queen. The reason is that while the king had several wives and many concubines, he could only marry women from the 6 leading Persian noble families. And the girls who were to become part of the king's harem were not volunteers. Instead, they were, in essence, kidnapped, and they had no right to return to their homes if they did not please the king. Now, with that, verses 5 through 7 of chapter 2 introduce Mordecai and Esther to us. Verses 5 through 7 say, "Now there was at the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassa, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter." Now, as a Benjamite, Mordecai was of the same tribe as King Saul, the first king of Israel. And his name, Mordecai, is probably the Babylonian or Hebraicized form of the Babylonian god Marduk. Now, this practice of giving Babylonian and Hebrew names to the same person arose during Israel's exile in Babylon. Now, Mordecai may have been a minor official in the Persian government. Chapter 2, verses 19 and 21 speak of his sitting at the king's gate, so that hints that he may have had some position. He also may have been a eunuch, because no wife or family is mentioned. Now, since Esther was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. That means that Mordecai and Esther were first cousins, although Mordecai clearly was considerably older than Esther, since he basically treated her as his own daughter. Now, Hadassa was Esther's Hebrew name. It means myrtle, which is an evergreen shrub it has glossy aromatic foliage and white flowers, followed by purple to black oval berries. To the Persians, the Jews, and Arabs, myrtle is a symbol of paradise. And in a spiritual context, the myrtle flower can also symbolize purification and rebirth. So while in the language of flowers, the white or creamy color of its blossoms symbolizes purity, hope, and innocence. Now, the name Esther probably derives from the Persian word for star, although some connect it with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. Now, verses 8 through 11, we see Esther finding favor in the king's palace. Those verses tell us, "So it came about, when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women, and found favor with him. So he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared." Now, Jewish historian Josephus reports that 400 young ladies were brought to Susa under Hagai's care as part of the beauty pageant. Now, in addition to being beautiful, Esther clearly had a winning personality. She pleased the eunuch in charge of the women, who provided her with special favors. But notice something. You may recall in the book of Daniel, did not eat the food that was provided to him when he was taken into exile. Unlike Daniel, Esther did eat the food and did not protest the food that was given to her. And in fact, in every way, her change of name from Hadassa to Esther, her eating the food given her, her taking advantage of the other benefits that Hegai conferred upon her, and her not revealing that she was Jewish, her sleeping with Ahasuerus before she was married, and then ultimately marrying King Ahasuerus. In all of these ways, Esther appears to have used her beauty without protest and accepted the advancement that it provided to her. But as I said, this book shows the providence of God working behind the scenes, and we will see Mordecai referring to that when we get to chapter 4. But that's one of the themes of this book. God is always at work. He's bringing about the execution of his plan through seemingly natural means, even when he does not appear to be present. Coincidences are not simply coincidences. I mean, think about it. In this case, the king got drunk at a party. If he hadn't gotten drunk, he probably would not have demanded that Vashti come and exhibit herself in front of a bunch of drunken men. I mean, Vashti had the character to refuse that, but because she refused the king's command, she was deposed as the queen, and ultimately the new queen selected was Esther, a Jew. And that fact proved to be necessary to save the Jews when they were slated for destruction by Haman, as we will see. So again, these things are not coincidences. God uses everything, including people's sin, including their drunkenness, including their rash decisions, but he's orchestrating things to bring about his own good ends. Now that leads to verses 12 through 14, which detail the procedure for the young women with the king. Verse 12, now when the turn of each young lady came to go in to King Ahasuerus, after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything that she desired was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now, these verses tell us what the procedure was that these 400 virgins, including Esther, would have followed. Now, the New American Standard, which I'm using in verse 14, says that the girl would return to the second harem. The Interlinear Bible and Young's literal translation translate those words as to the second house of the women. In other words, those there was a separate place for the concubines, and those rejected by the king and not summoned by him again essentially lived the rest of their lives like widows, alone, had no chance of marriage and no chance of getting out of essentially their imprisonment in the harem or the house of the concubines. Well, how Esther becomes queen is detailed in chapter 2, verses 15 through 18, which say this. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail and uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in as his daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So she, Esther's, look at, I mentioned Esther obviously was beautiful, as the book says, but she was also smart. She used her beauty, but note that she did whatever Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women, said, and she was able to use all of these things to her ultimate advantage. But note her modesty in not requesting anything other than what Hegai advised her, in contrast with all the other girls who were given anything they desired. And so, although she was physically beautiful, I think to a large degree it was because of her character that, according to verse 15, Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. In fact, the typical Hebrew expression, found favor in the eyes of, is in the passive tense. But in Esther, the narrator of this book constantly uses an awkward and more active construction. In other words, Esther rose in favor. We see that construction in chapter 2, verses 9, 15, and 17, and again in chapter 5, verse 2. And so this active construction of her finding favor suggests that Esther did not simply passively found favor, but she won favor. She actually pulls and lifts the favor out of others. She did not simply passively receive favor on account of her beauty alone. She knew how to use what she had. In other words, she used what God had given her, her beauty, her personality, even though some of what she had was derived from human technology, namely the cosmetics and the food. And that's a lesson for all of us. We need to use what God has given us, the gifts, talents, abilities that He's given us, and the things that we get from human means, our education, our health, by good diet and exercise and so on and so forth, and so that we can be winsome and do good to others, similar to what Esther did. Now, one thing that we should reflect on is that much like Persian society in Esther's day, our cultures and societies today largely value externals, wealth, power, possessions, such as the king had, or beauty and refinement, such as Esther had. And to one degree or another, everybody is influenced and affected by these cultural values. As 1 Samuel 16, verse 7 says, man looks at the outside, but God looks at the heart. And so this raises the issue, as I mentioned in the introduction, of how do we relate to our culture and its values? To what extent do we go along in order to get along with the culture? To what extent do we withdraw from the culture? To what extent do we protest against the culture? If we don't think about these things, we're likely to be enslaved by the culture and its values without even realizing it. Now, the end of chapter 2, verses 19 and 20, reveal an important fact that will play an important role later on in this story. Namely, they say, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. So in other words, she's Jewish, but she does not make that fact known. So we don't know the specific reason for this secrecy, but as I mentioned, it will form an important part of this book later on. I said that verses 19 and 20 were the end of chapter 2. Actually, chapter 2 ends at verses 21 to 23, which again reveal another important fact that will play an important role in this story. Namely, Mordecai saves the king's life. Verses 21 through 23 state, in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now, it doesn't say why Bigthan and Teresh became angry with the king. In the Septuagint has a number of additions. The Septuagintal version of the book of Esther has a number of additions that are not contained in the Hebrew account. And the Septuagint says that the reason that Bigthan and Teresh became angry was because Mordecai had been promoted. Now, plots against Persian monarchs were not uncommon, and in fact, historically, King Xerxes was actually assassinated by one of his officials in 465 BC. So Mordecai saves his life, but the king did not reward him. Now, we'll learn the importance of that later on. But this whole event recalls something that happened. Remember when Joseph was in prison. When Joseph was in prison, he interpreted a dream by the chief cupbearer. And then shortly thereafter, the chief cupbearer was released from prison, and Joseph said, please remember me to the king, or to the Pharaoh, but the cupbearer forgot, and it was some years before something happened that the cupbearer remembered that Joseph had correctly interpreted the dream. But again, these things do not happen by accident. They're not just coincidences. God's timing may not be our timing, but he is always at work in carrying out his plan. And I mentioned the commonality between this event, Mordecai saving the king, it being recorded, but he received no reward, and when Joseph correctly interpreted the cupbearer's dream when he was in prison. There are a number, actually, of interesting parallels or commonalities between the story of Esther and the story of Joseph as it is recorded in Genesis. For example, Joseph finds favor in the eyes of others, as does Esther. Joseph is loved by a father figure, Jacob, just as Esther is loved by Mordecai, a father figure. And like Esther, Joseph is physically beautiful, and as indicated in Genesis 39, verse 6. Joseph also attracted the sexual attention of someone, namely Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39, just as, of course, Esther was sexually attractive to King Ahasuerus. And it is repeatedly said in the story of Joseph in Genesis that Joseph finds favor in the eyes of his superiors, and he's given favor by his superiors, and ultimately winning even the Pharaoh's favor and trust, just as Esther found favor in the eyes of Haggai, and then finds favor, the favor and devotion of King Ahasuerus. And so, Esther goes from being a beauty queen without the necessary courage to defend her people, but like Joseph, she develops into a leader capable of achieving a hard-fought victory and the salvation of her people, just as Joseph in Egypt rose to the second spot in the land and saved his people and all kinds of others from starvation. And so, again, there's this great reversal. Esther goes from being an orphan girl, a Jewish girl, to become the queen. And just as Joseph was reversed and became the second leading man in the entire nation of Egypt. And so, and as we will see, Esther, when Mordecai said, you need to go to the king to tell him about this plot to kill all the Jews, she was afraid. She said, I risked my life. Well, her fear of death, when she did go in to see the king held up his scepter to her, and her fear of death was turned entirely upside down by the elevation of Mordecai, as we will see. He ends up being appointed the second leading man in the Persian Empire, and as we will see, the overwhelming triumph of the Jews against their enemies, and that's what Purim celebrates, the victory of the Jews over their enemies who tried to destroy them. So, interestingly enough, as I mentioned, although Joseph is not mentioned in the book of Esther, just as there are some veiled foreshadows to the church and the gospel in Esther, there are a number of commonalities between the story of Joseph and the story of Esther. And in the next lecture, we will look at the great problem that arises, which results in, of course, which is why Esther needed to be the queen, because her people are all threatened with death by Haman. So we will take a look at that in the next lecture.